Joining us now to talk about this monumental case again is NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. Gary, thanks for taking time with us. We appreciate it. You just heard those remarks from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Roberts. What else stood out to you that you heard today from the justices?
A couple big things here. One, I think the practicality is a huge part of it. You mentioned it there. Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett calling this potentially a messy situation. Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson saying, what are you going to do? Bring pregnant women in for depositions? How exactly is this going to work? There were not a lot of answers as to how exactly this was going to work from Solicitor General John Sauer. He suggested that perhaps people will be able to challenge not being considered a U.S. citizen or their babies not being considered a U.S. citizen after they're born and after they're told that their child is not a U.S. citizen. And of course, this is going to impact tens of thousands of people as soon as this could eventually come down from the Supreme Court at the end of June or early July. The other big thing I think that was discussed today was the idea that there's not much case law that John Sauer, the Solicitor General, had to really rely on here. And this was on both sides of the ideological spectrum, this idea. We had Neil Gorsuch saying, what are you doing, relying on Roman law sources, as in sources from 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Justice Kagan saying she thought some of these sources and some of this case law that he was relying on was obscure in nature. So of course, the 14th Amendment was written in 1884 and 1886. So that was certainly a long time ago, but some of what is in there is still very much an issue today.
This was also the first time a sitting president was in on those oral arguments today. Tell us a little bit about the significance of President Trump's attendance.
Yeah, President Trump has visited the Supreme Court twice before, once for the investitures, which is like a formal ceremony when both Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch were named to the Supreme Court, but he never actually sat in for arguments before, and no president has ever sat in for arguments before, and there's a real reason for that, right? The Supreme Court is always supposed to be seen as this independent branch, this co-equal third branch of government that is very politically separate from Congress, from the White House, and when President Trump walked in to the Supreme Court courthouse today, our colleague Lawrence Hurley was there in the room. He said, in fact, he walked in just like anybody else would have. He walked in, he sat down in the public area, he sat in the first row of the general public, and sat through the entirety of the government's arguments. He did leave halfway through the arguments for the ACLU, so we didn't get to fully hear what Cecilia Wang had to say.
Gary, is there any path for the Supreme Court to rule in favor of the president?
So there are some legal scholars that believe that perhaps the Supreme Court could sort of split the baby here, if you will. In terms of the similar text that is in the 14th Amendment, it is also existing in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was passed by Congress. So perhaps what the Supreme Court could do is strike down the Immigration and Nationality Act portion of this text, but not touch the 14th Amendment. That would put the ball into Congress's court. Now, would Congress ever do something like slashing the 14th Amendment or changing the 14th Amendment? That seems like a really high bar to reach there. It certainly doesn't seem like something that would happen today. Based on what we heard from the arguments, it does appear like the Supreme Court will be upholding the 14th Amendment.
All right. Thank you for sharing your insights. NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. We appreciate you taking time with us.